The scream died before it reached her lips. Etha's hand froze mid-paw as another howl shattered the night. Closer this time. Much closer. The bottle of aged whiskey trembled in her grip, amber liquid sloshing against crystal, as she forced herself to finish serving a drink no customer would come to claim. Not anymore. Not since Thorga had turned Ravencliff into its personal hunting ground. A child's laughter echoed in her memory. Young Thomas, the stable boy, always begging for stories of her homeland beyond the misty peaks. Now his name was just another whisper in the growing list of the dead. His blood had been the first to stain the cobblestones, but far from the last. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the empty chairs and tables of the Last Drop Tavern through rain-streaked windows. Each flash cast twisted shadows that danced across walls steeped in 3 centuries of stories. But none of those tales could match the horror of what stalked their streets now. The door burst open with a thunderclap, and Etha's heart stopped. But it wasn't Thorga's massive frame that filled the doorway. The stranger who entered moved like a storm-given flesh, all coiled violence wrapped in fur and scaled leather. Rain dripped from a sword hilt worn smooth by years of desperate use, and his eyes held something that made even the shadows retreat to darker corners. Human had never looked less human. Another howl ripped through the night, closer than ever before. The stranger's head snapped toward the sound, and a smile crept across his scarred face, the kind of smile that promised blood and broken bones. As thunder shook the foundations of the old tavern, Etha couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to witness a collision between 2 forces of nature, and Ravencliff might not survive what was about to be unleashed. The stranger stalked to the bar, each step deliberate, predatory. His boots, caked with mud and something darker, left wet prints on centuries-old floorboards that creaked beneath his weight. The candlelight caught the scars on his face, a tapestry of violence that told stories of battles won and horrors survived. "Allez," he growled, voice like gravel over steel. 3 copper coins hit the counter with a sound that echoed in the empty tavern. Etha's fingers trembled as she reached for a tankard, her elven grace at odds with the fear that made her movements jerky, uncertain. "You're a coin short," she managed, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. The stranger's eyes met hers, and she saw something ancient in them, something that reminded her of the wild places where civilization feared to tread. The 4th coin joined its brothers with a clink that seemed to mock the growing storm outside. Etha filled his tankard, the rich amber liquid catching the light like liquid gold. The stranger took it without a word, but his attention was already elsewhere, scanning the windows with the focused intensity of a wolf scenting prey. "The beast," he said suddenly, making Etha jump. "Thorga, tell me." It wasn't a request. Etha found herself speaking before she could think better of it, the words tumbling out like the rain beating against the tavern's walls. She told him of the first disappearance, Thomas, found in pieces across the stable yard, of the farms falling silent one by one, of families vanishing in the night leaving only blood-stained beds and splintered doors, of how Ravencliff had withered, its people either fled or hiding behind barred windows and iron-bound doors. The stranger listened in silence, taking slow, measured sips of his ale. His eyes never stopped moving, tracking shadows that seemed to grow deeper with each flash of lightning. When Etha finished, he set his tankard down with a deliberation that made her skin crawl. "Iron hinges," he muttered, moving to examine the door. "Good. Strong." His hand caressed the metal like a lover, and for a moment, Etha thought she saw something like satisfaction in his expression. A roar shook the night, closer than any before, and Etha's blood turned to ice. The sound carried rage and hunger, and something else, intelligence. This was no mere beast that stalked their streets. This was something that enjoyed the terror it created. The stranger's reaction was unexpected. He smiled, a terrible, savage thing that transformed his face into something barely human. Without warning, he threw open the door, letting in a blast of wind and rain. "Keep it unlocked," he commanded, and then he was gone, swallowed by the storm and darkness. Etha stood frozen, the empty tankard forgotten in her hands. Through the open door she could hear it, the sound of 2 predators circling each other in the rain-soaked streets of her dying town. Thunder rolled overhead, and in its echo she heard another sound, a roar that came not from Thorga, but from something just as savage, just as primal. The hunt had begun, and Ravencliff was about to become a battlefield. The iron hinges groaned as Etha moved to close the door, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The stranger's words echoed in her mind, "Keep it unlocked," but fear won out over obligation. Her fingers had barely brushed the lock when the door exploded inward, showering the room with splinters and broken dreams. Torga filled the doorway like a nightmare given flesh. Rainwater streamed from matted fur that couldn't quite hide the constellation of scars beneath, testament to countless battles won against those who dared to stand against it. Its eyes, amber pools of ancient malice, fixed on Etha with terrible intelligence. The beast's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing yellowed fangs longer than her fingers. "Little elf," it growled, its voice like stones grinding against bones. "So long I've watched you, alone in your empty den. Tonight we feast together." Etha scrambled backward, her heel catching on an uneven floorboard. She fell, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Thorga moved with impossible speed for something so massive, its clawed hand closing around her throat with crushing force. The beast lifted her as easily as she might lift a tankard, bringing her face close to its own. Hot breath that reeked of old blood washed over her as it opened its maw wide. "On my life you will feast no more." The roar that filled the tavern wasn't Thorga's. The stranger burst through the doorway like an avalanche, his eyes blazing with something that went beyond rage, beyond hatred. He slammed into Thorga's side with bone-crushing force, and Etha found herself suddenly free, gasping for air on the ale-soaked floor. What followed wasn't a fight, it was a collision of primal forces. Thorga's claws raked across the stranger's chest, opening red furrows in leather and flesh alike. But where others would have fallen, the stranger seemed to grow stronger. He caught the beast's next strike and drove his elbow into its jaw with a crack that shook the rafters. "You dare?" The stranger's voice had changed, become something deeper, older. "You dare hunt in my territory?" Each word was punctuated by a blow that would have felled an oak. Thorga tried to bite, to tear, but the stranger caught its muzzle in hands that seemed to have turned to iron. "You are like me, Logner." Thorga's words came out gargled, mixed with blood and pain. The stranger's response was a roar that made the beast's earlier sounds seem like a kitten's mewl. "I am not like you!" He twisted, muscles bulging beneath torn leather and fur, and there was a sound like green wood splintering. Thorga's arms, those terrible weapons that had torn through so many of Ravencliff's citizens, came free in a spray of dark blood. The beast's scream of agony was cut short as the stranger grabbed its head and threw it bodily through the doorway. "Die in the dirt like the dog you are," he bellowed after the broken creature. Silence fell, broken only by the stranger's heavy breathing and the steady drip of blood, both his and Thorga's, on the wooden floor. Slowly he turned to face Etha, who still lay where she'd fallen. His eyes, which had blazed with inhuman fury moments before, now held something almost like amusement. "Hail," he said simply, as if he hadn't just torn a monster apart with his bare hands. And in that moment, Etha realized that Thorga hadn't been the only monster stalking Ravencliff that night. The only difference was that this one was on their side. For now, the rain intensified, drumming against the tavern roof like war drums as Etha shakily poured the stranger his ale. Blood, both his and Thorga's, mingled with rainwater at his feet, creating dark spirals on the wooden floor. The wounds across his chest should have been fatal, yet they were already beginning to close, flesh knitting together in a way that defied nature. "You're not human," Etha whispered, setting the tankard before him with trembling hands. The stranger's laugh was harsh, like steel scraping bone. "Neither was Thorga. Neither are you, elf." He drained the ale in one long swallow, his eyes never leaving the door. "But tonight isn't about what we are. It's about what hunts in the dark." A howl pierced the night, weaker now, but filled with a rage that made the candles flicker. Thorga was wounded but not dead. The stranger's lips curled into something that might have been a smile on a human face. On his, it looked like a promise of violence. "The beast will head for the old catacombs beneath the church," he said, rolling his shoulders like a fighter preparing for another round. "They always do. dark places where the earth remembers older gods and older powers. He turned those ancient eyes on Etha. Tell me about the tunnels. Etha found herself speaking of things she'd rather forget, of the network of passages that honeycombed the earth beneath Ravencliff, of the ancient stones carved with symbols no scholar could read, of the whispers that echoed through those dark corridors on moonless nights. The entrance is through the church crypt, she said, memories of her own explorations rising unbidden. But no one goes there anymore, not since the disappearances started. No, the stranger agreed, moving toward the door. No one but the desperate and the damned. He paused at the threshold, rain plastering his hair to his scarred face. And tonight, I am both. He stepped into the storm, but Etha found herself calling after him. Wait, what are you? The stranger turned, and for a moment his eyes glowed with an inner fire that spoke of ancient battles and forgotten powers. I am what walks between, he said, his voice carrying over the thunder. I am what hunts the hunters. I am the reason monsters fear the dark. Then he was gone, leaving Etha alone with her thoughts and the growing certainty that she couldn't simply wait behind her bar while history wrote itself in blood through the streets of her town. With trembling fingers, she reached beneath the counter and withdrew an old ironwood bow, its surface worn smooth by centuries of use. She might not be a monster or a hunter, but this was her home, and tonight she would fight for it. The real battle for Ravencliff was about to begin. Etha stepped into the rain-slicked streets, her boots splashing through puddles that reflected lightning like shattered mirrors. The trail wasn't hard to follow. Blood mixed with rainwater marked Thorger's desperate flight toward the church, dark droplets gleaming on cobblestones like fallen stars. The town was a ghost of itself. Shuttered windows stared like blind eyes, and the wind carried whispers of those who'd fled or fallen to Thorger's hunger. 3 months of terror had transformed Ravencliff from a bustling market town into a tomb where only the bravest, or most foolish, still dwelled. The old church loomed ahead, its spire piercing the storm-wicked sky like a black needle. Once, its bells had called the faithful to prayer. Now they hung silent, their ropes rotting in the tower, where the last bell ringer had vanished, leaving only bloodstains on the wooden steps. A crash echoed from within, followed by a roar that shook dust from the ancient stones. Etha knocked an arrow as she approached the massive oak doors, already splintered inward. Inside, the nave was a battlefield. Pews lay shattered, and moonlight streaming through stained glass cast colored shadows across scenes of recent violence. The stranger stood at the altar, blood running freely from fresh wounds. Thorger crouched before him, its massive form distorted by missing limbs, yet somehow more terrifying for its injuries. The beast's eyes blazed with hatred and something else, recognition. Rather, Thorger snarled, its voice wet with blood. You cannot deny what you are, what we both are. I deny nothing, the stranger replied, his voice carrying echoes of ancient power. I embrace what I am. That's what makes me different from you, beast. I choose what monster I become. Thorger lunged, its remaining claws seeking the stranger's throat, but the hunter was ready. He caught the beast's attack with inhuman strength, using its momentum to slam it into the altar. Stone cracked, and beneath it, something older stirred. The floor gave way with a sound like the earth itself screaming. Etha watched in horror as both figures disappeared into the darkness below. Without thinking, she ran forward, bow ready, and peered into the abyss. Ancient steps spiraled down into darkness, where the true heart of Ravencliff's horror waited to be discovered. From below came sounds of combat and something else, chanting in a language that made her blood run cold. The real story was about to begin in the depths beneath the church, where old gods slumbered and ancient powers waited to be awakened. Taking a deep breath, Etha descended into the darkness, following the sounds of 2 monsters locked in a battle that would determine not just the fate of Ravencliff, but perhaps the very nature of what it meant to be human, or something else entirely. The catacombs stretched before her like an open wound in the earth, air heavy with the scent of ancient stone and something metallic that might have been blood. Etha's elven sight pierced the gloom, revealing walls carved with symbols that seemed to writhe in the darkness, warnings in languages long forgotten by all but the oldest of her kind. The sounds of combat echoed through the tunnels, distorted by age-smoothed stone until they became something inhuman. Following them, she discovered chambers that told stories of Ravencliff's true history, altars stained dark with centuries of sacrifice, bones that spoke of creatures that should not exist, and everywhere, those symbols, pulsing now with a sickly light that grew stronger as she descended deeper. She found them in what must have been a temple once. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness, supported by columns carved to resemble twisted figures frozen in eternal agony. At its center, a pool of black liquid reflected no light, and around it, the stranger and Thorger circled each other like primal forces given flesh. "You feel it," Thorger growled, its wounds healing before Etha's eyes as it drew power from the ancient place. "The old ones stir. They call to our blood, brother, to what we truly are." The stranger's response was a laugh that shook dust from the ceiling. "I feel it, just as I feel the lives you've taken, the fear you've sown." His form seemed to shift in the darkness, becoming something larger, more primal. "But you forgot the most important truth about monsters, brother." "And what truth is that?" Thorger's voice had changed too, becoming deeper, older, filled with echoes of things that should have remained buried. "Is always a bigger one." What followed was no longer a fight between man and beast. It was a battle between forces of nature, between concepts given flesh. They moved faster than thought, their forms blurring between human and something else entirely. The very air seemed to crack with the power they wielded. Etha watched, her bow forgotten in her hands, as they crashed together, again and again. Each impact sent shockwaves through the ancient chamber, causing the black pool to ripple with images of places that should not exist. The symbols on the walls blazed brighter, responding to the violence before them. Then Thorger made its mistake. Drunk on the power of this ancient place, it lunged for the stranger's throat, leaving itself open. The stranger moved with the liquid grace of a nightmare, his hands now tipped with claws that gleamed like obsidian, plunging deep into Thorger's chest. "You are not the monster this town needs," the stranger growled, his voice a symphony of broken things. "You are merely the monster it fears." With a sound like reality tearing, he pulled. Thorger's roar of agony shook the foundations of the earth itself, but it was cut short as something vital, something glowing with corrupt power came free in the stranger's grasp. The beast's true heart pulsed once, twice, then burst into black flame as the stranger crushed it. Thorger's massive form collapsed, already beginning to crumble into dust that the darkness eagerly devoured. Silence fell in the ancient chamber, broken only by the soft splash of blood dripping into the black pool. The stranger turned to face Etha, his form slowly settling back into something almost human. Almost. "It's done," he said simply, though his voice still carried echoes of what he'd become. "The town is yours again." He moved past her toward the exit, but paused at the threshold. "But remember, little elf, there are always bigger monsters, and sometimes that's exactly what we need." Dawn broke over Ravencliff like a fever lifting, painting the rain-washed streets in hues of gold and promise. Etha stood in the doorway of the Last Drop, watching as the first townspeople emerged from their homes, blinking in sunlight that seemed brighter somehow, cleaner. The stranger was gone, having vanished into the night after their return from the catacombs. He'd left nothing behind save a single gold coin on the counter, payment for his last ale, and perhaps something more, a reminder that some debts could never truly be settled. But he'd left other marks on the town. The entrance to the catacombs had collapsed, burying those ancient secrets beneath tons of stone and earth. The old church would need to be rebuilt, its foundations now unstable. Yet, as Etha watched workers already gathering to begin repairs, she realized that perhaps some destruction was necessary for renewal. Children played in the streets again, their laughter chasing away the last echoes of Thorger's howls. Farmers returned to their fields, merchants to their stalls. Life crept back into Ravencliff like spring after a particularly harsh winter. Yet something had changed in the town's very nature. The people moved differently now, more aware of the shadows that lingered in corners. They hung iron above their doors and kept their children close after sunset. They remembered. Etha kept the Last Drop's door unlocked now, even after dark. Some nights, when the moon was full and the wind carried whispers of distant howls, travelers would appear at her bar. They were always different, yet somehow the same, scarred, weather-worn figures with ancient eyes and weapons worn smooth from desperate use. They never stayed long, just enough for a single ale and perhaps a quiet word about what lurked in the dark places of the world. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when thunder rolled across the sky and rain lashed against her windows, Etha would catch herself listening for heavy footsteps and the clink of copper coins on worn wood, waiting for the return of the monster who had saved them all. But the stranger never returned to Ravencliff. He didn't need to. His lesson remained. Sometimes the only thing that could stand between humanity and the darkness was something that walked the line between both. Sometimes, to fight monsters, you needed monsters of your own. The Last Drop's sign still creaked in the wind, but its sound had changed. No longer a death rattle, but a reminder, a promise that in every shadow there was light, in every monster a choice, and in every ending the seed of a new beginning. Etha smiled as she poured another ale for a customer, a real one this time. Life went on in Ravencliff. Different now, perhaps, wiser, certainly, but life went on. And if sometimes the nights seemed a little darker, the shadows a little deeper, well, that was the price of knowing what really lurked in the darkness. That was the price of survival. Years passed, and life in Ravencliff settled into a new rhythm. Yet, on quiet nights, when rain drummed against the tavern's windows, Etha found herself wondering about the stranger who had saved their town. The answer came on a winter evening, through the words of an elderly traveller who recognized the description of the hunter who had slain Thorga. The stranger, she learned, had once been Marcus Vale, a monster hunter from the northern kingdoms, but his transformation began not with a curse or a bite, but with a choice. During a plague of beasts that threatened to overwhelm his homeland, Marcus had discovered an ancient ritual in the catacombs beneath a forgotten monastery. The ritual promised the power to fight monsters on their own terms, but at a terrible price. He would have to become something between human and beast himself. Desperate to save his people, Marcus underwent the ritual, allowing ancient powers to reshape his flesh and bone. His jaw elongated, filled with teeth meant for rending monster flesh, his muscles densified beyond human limits. His blood became something other, something that let him heal from wounds that would kill ordinary men. The ritual worked, but it marked him forever. He could never again live among normal people, could never show his face in daylight markets or sit comfortably in crowded halls. Instead, he wandered the dark places of the world, hunting creatures like Thorga and like himself. Etha kept this knowledge close, understanding finally why the stranger had been so insistent that he wasn't like Thorga. Both were monsters, yes, but one had chosen his transformation to protect others, while the other had embraced monstrosity for the joy of causing pain. The Last Drop's door remained unlocked at night, and sometimes, when the wind carried howls from distant hills, Etha would pour an extra ale and leave it on the counter. It was never there in the morning, though whether it was claimed by her monster-hunting savior or simply cleared away with the dawn, she never knew for certain. Some questions, she realized, were better left as mysteries. If you enjoyed this tale of monsters, sacrifice, and redemption, make sure to like and subscribe to hear more stories from the darker corners of our world. Hit that notification bell to be the first to know when new legends emerge from the shadows. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Was the stranger truly a monster or something more? Your support helps keep these stories alive. And remember, not all monsters lurk in darkness. Sometimes they're the ones protecting us from what lies beyond. Until next time, keep your doors unlocked and your iron close. You never know when a stranger might need a drink, or when you might need a monster of your own.